Got it.
Got it. I like how American that is. Got it.
Yeah, it's almost as Zoom was invented in America. Anyway, welcome to everyone who's joining in. We have a mega audience joining us tonight, so it'll take a few moments for everyone to connect in. So if we just wait for a couple of minutes. But while we do that, it's great to see you all, well, see your names anyway on the screen. It's always a pleasure every month. As people are connecting in, for those of you who have not joined us before, because actually we have such a large number actually joining, so there may be some of you who for some unbeknown reason have not been to one of our lectures. Welcome to the Society for Church Archaeology. We offer these lectures for free, and it's great that you can join us from all around the world. And I dare not open my chat box because I know what will happen at this point, but it's great to see everyone joining in, really for a global audience. Obviously, we can only do these lectures if you support us. Although we don't charge for the lectures, we would be eternally grateful if you would consider joining the Society. So if you just look at our webpage, you can just search for the Society for Church Archaeology. You can find out about joining us. Not only do we do these lectures, we have publications, we have an annual conference, and there's all sorts of exciting reasons to become part of the church family. Tonight, while our speakers are talking, if you have any questions, do put those questions into the chat box. And then Rob, the computer wizard, will field those questions and put them to our speaker. People still connecting in, Rob, or have we? Oh.
Still got a steady stream of people coming in.
Okay, right, fantastic. We won't start quite yet. We don't want to miss the catch. But interestingly, we're broadcasting tonight from not quite so sunny. Well, actually, it was very sunny this morning. Yorkshire. Our speaker, myself, and Rob are all in God's own country, so they're just in the wrong riding. So
there's no wrong riding here.
So you'll be hearing all about ridings, I know, during this talk, yes, as well. But I think what I will do is, people are probably still connecting in, but I will introduce our speaker, who should be, oh, you know, I was wondering where people were from, and we haven't actually had anyone tell us, but Tennessee. I imagine it's a lot warmer in Tennessee than whichever riding of Yorkshire one wants to be in at the moment. Anyway, I will introduce our speaker before I get far too diverted. It's all started now. She should be well known to many of you, certainly those of you who are supporters of our society, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, are you the longest serving member of the committee after Jackie?
It's got to be Jackie, I think, and then probably me. Yeah, I came in on as a PhD student because I was the only one who knew how to work the internet. So that's why I got originally.
Wow, gosh. So yes, our veritable Steve Jobs of the society is well known. So she's been involved far longer than I have. So many of you will know that she is a medieval archaeologist who specializes in churches, which is handy, but also commemoration, and particularly focusing on the Anglo-Norman period. All three, I suspect, will intersect tonight in the talk. And she is, of course, a senior lecturer at the University of York. So tonight she's going to be talking to us about one of her favorite topics, I suspect, which is the medieval cross slabs in northern England. So I'm expecting a good West Riding representation in this
There's
talk.
some stuff from the West Riding, don't you?
Fantastic. Right, well, at that point, I will hand over to Alex and let her take it from here.
Okay, well, I will try to share my screen just now. Okay, and obviously, Hugh or anybody jump in if something goes wrong and you can't see what I'm showing or saying. So welcome everybody. I'm really excited to see such a big crowd and clearly from the messages in the chat from all around the world. I hope you find this interesting and you haven't signed up on false pretenses thinking I'm going to talk about Pictish cross slabs or anything really, really exciting like that. And thanks to the committee, particularly Hugh and Rob for railroading me into speaking tonight. As Hugh says, I've been sitting on the committee for long enough that I think I wasn't going to get away without doing one of these talks forever. So my time has come. So what I'm going to focus on in my talk tonight is a project that I've worked on over the past few years called Cross Slab Grave Monuments in Northern England. And I've got a handy date there of 1000 to 1600, although those are loose dates. So what I'm going to do is introduce you first to the project and our approach and go over some of the main patterns and the interesting correlations that we found so far, with the caveat that our analysis is really of this enormous amount of monumental material is only really at its early stages. And then dig into a bit of specifics on some of the slabs themselves and the medieval people and aspects of society that they might help us to better understand. So the project's been carried out by myself and Peter Ryder, who's an independent scholar who's really been a champion of this monument form, and for a long time was the only person doing anything with cross slabs. And he had already published a few standalone catalogs from various northern counties. And we carried out a substantial amount of new fieldwork supported primarily by the Mark Fitch Fund and also some funding from the Department of Archaeology at York. And the aim of the project as a whole is to produce the first major synthesis of this type of grave monument across the northern counties of England, where cross slabs were by far the most prevalent and significant medieval monumental form. And I'll explain in a bit how we categorize cross slabs in a bit more detail, as it's not always, there are some overlaps with other forms of monumental sculpture. In terms of what's come out of it so far, we're working up a full catalog of Yorkshire, which is the only, although there's a small a catalog of the medieval grave covers from West Yorkshire, modern West Yorkshire. The rest of the writing hasn't been published in full catalog form, so we're going to do that with BAR. And I've also put out another publication, which you can see there, discussing secondary emblems on cross slabs, which is drawing on some material from across the whole northern database. And if you search out the festschrift for Jerome Bertram, the Monuments Man, you can see that. So even though cross slabs are definitely the most common surviving medieval monument in Northern England, they may once have also been that in other parts of England too. They've taken a back seat to brasses and sculpted effigies in a lot of academic study and in the popular conception of medieval commemoration. So from an academic standpoint, we've really had a skewed and I think incomplete sense of the full range of commemorative practice in the Middle Ages. And that lack of academic research has had a knock-on effect to the public's knowledge of them and awareness of them. So as a result of this, a lot of parish communities don't know the significance of the monuments they have. And they suffer from weathering and damage and even outright loss because the parishes don't know what they are and whether they're important and how to protect them. So a key focus of the project has been both to raise the academic and the public profile of cross slabs and to get parish communities engaged in curating them so that this monument form that's particularly important to Northern English history and culture can be preserved and promoted and usefully studied in the future. So the project as a whole has a data set of just over 4,000 monuments, and it encompasses the historic counties of Yorkshire, Durham, Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland. It's been collected through the collation of records in Peter's already published surveys, previously unpublished work that had been done by both me and by Peter, and a substantial program of new recording in the East and West Ridings of Yorkshire and around the city and district of York to make sure that we had full coverage of Yorkshire. And although it wasn't part of our project, a separate survey of Derbyshire has been carried out, paid for by the county council there, and they very kindly allowed that to be added to our database. So we have the information from Derbyshire as well. So hopefully this overview of the project will demonstrate the archaeological potential, not only of cross slab monuments, but of the methodology we've undertaken to do this, and in analyzing these sorts of monuments over a very wide region and over long periods of time. So in our academic approaches, where this project differs from some more traditional monument studies is that first and most importantly, we've undertaken systematic recording. We're not cherry picking the best or most attractive examples. We're recording everything from the finest complete monuments to the smallest fragments of cross shafts. And secondly, we're concerned with trying to do more than just a stylistic appraisal or making a typology and chronology of the monuments, although we're doing that as well. Recent work on grave monuments has shown the usefulness of examining the economic dimensions of their production and consumption, and this project will take that into account. But we also want to move beyond just the functional side of things too, to explore the religious dimension of monuments and also the social meanings of commemoration. So work by scholars like David Stocker for Viking Age monuments and John Finch for the later medieval period has shown that throughout the Middle Ages, patrons used commemorative monuments to define their own identities and that of their families and their legacies. And they used them as a way of cementing their social status or trying to move up in the world. And medieval grave monuments were obviously a means by which the dead were remembered. So they had religious and spiritual significance, but they were also profoundly important in the secular realm too. And from the 11th century until the end of the Middle Ages, cross slabs became, especially in Northern England, a primary way for patrons to influence through material culture the relationships that they depended on for their social standing. They were a way for people to express personal and communal identities that they derived from their social status, their occupation or their role in society, the places they lived, and the various cultures they operated within. And we also want to think about the audience of the monuments, not just the patrons. What were you meant to think or do or understand when you interacted with a cross slab? And which audiences were patrons trying to engage with? It's important to remember that these were not just objects that people passively looked at. In the medieval religious mind, intercessory prayers and active participation in commemoration by the living were essential to get the dead through purgatory. So monuments needed to make people do things. So we need to think about what living people did with the monuments of the dead. How did they understand them? And who were those people who were viewing them and engaging with them? And cross slabs are thus a way that we can access a really complex web of identities and purposes which connected medieval patrons and audiences. And they can give us some insight into the social and cultural structures in which people created these identities. Our approach also emphasizes that these were not objects which existed in a vacuum. They were erected in landscapes and settlements and buildings, and so they can hopefully help us better understand the character of those locales and the people in them as well. So what are cross slabs and why should we bother recording them? Cross slab is a pretty generic, but I think widely accepted term for a varied but fairly distinctive commemorative tradition. It sometimes gets confusing because it's also used for the large early medieval upright Pictish stones as well. But if you're reading something about the later Middle Ages and it's not in Scotland, if you see the word cross slab, then probably these are the monuments that somebody is talking about. Medieval cross slabs are generally made of stone. They're primarily non-effigial, although there are some examples where we have some attempts at effigial representation, which I'll talk about later. They usually feature a cross as their central motif, although not always, and they're mostly, but not always, recumbent. They do seem maybe to come into use in England just before the Norman conquest. The dating is difficult to be super precise, and there's some overlap with definite pre-conquest commemorative traditions, but they do really take off in popularity after the conquest, so from the late 11th and early 12th centuries onwards. The earliest cross slabs definitely predate brasses and full effigies by a couple centuries. But even after these other forms of commemoration were introduced, cross slabs do continue to be commissioned. And in some parts of the country, like the North, they remain the most commonly used monument throughout the whole of the Middle Ages. They're popular from the late 11th century until the Reformation in Northern England. That it seems to stop a little earlier in other areas of the country. There are cross slabs in other areas of the country where brasses and things like that seem to completely take over. But in Northern England, we do see them used throughout the whole of the later Middle Ages. And in some unusual cases, like these examples from Cumbria or Northumberland, the tradition in a slightly various form seems to persist beyond the Reformation, and these may belong to recusant Catholic individuals in the north, east, and northwest. As you can see from this, these pictures that I've put up here, cross slabs display a remarkably wide variety of forms and styles and iconographic motifs once you start looking at them in detail. And what you see here is not only a variety of styles, but a wide range of dates. So the earliest of them is probably this standing marker and this other small slab with this kind of Maltese cross. Then this bracelet cross, which is the most common type that we see throughout the country, and across all cross slab forms, is probably from the early 13th century, maybe the late 12th. This one, which is a little hard to see, but it's a kind of wheel-shaped cross, is from the late 13th or early 14th century. And then this big straight-armed cross with the heraldic shield is probably from the 15th century. And there is some hangover, as I said earlier, from previous commemorative traditions. So this standing marker, although the crosshead is a little bit different, calls to mind the standing monuments of Viking Age Yorkshire. So when they come in, they're not paying no attention to what went before. They are aware often of traditions, and there's some very interesting kind of weird overlap pieces that seem to sit somewhere in the 11th century. We can also see some major size differences. Some of them are coffin lids, but they're not always. And the level of preservation and where we find them is different too. Some are loose, some are built into walls in the medieval period. Sometimes they're built into benches in the 19th or 20th century, and some may be in situ out in the churchyard. And unless we dig underneath them, we don't really know. Some of these would have been internal monuments, and some would have been external, always meant to be outside. It's very hard to tell which is which, except for some of the very big, chunky monuments, which have gables and copes and things like that, and they may well have been outside. For the others, it's hard to tell. In addition to the cross, and sometimes instead of it, the slabs often have secondary emblems, which seem to have related to the status or occupation or personal identity of the deceased. And here you can see some examples. The most common ones are swords or other military items, so like a shield, or here we have a spear down the side. These probably indicate men, and probably men of a certain higher status. Later on, as in that example I showed just before, in this one, you do see some elements of heraldic devices, which may be indicating particularly knightly status, but not everyone who has a sword in their monument is probably a knight in our kind of traditional reckoning of it. Sometimes there are shears and keys. So here you can see an example of a pair of shears, which are understood to be female emblems. There are priestly and clerical emblems, such as chalices, patens, and books, and tools of particular trades or crafts, such as blacksmiths, carpenters and builders, and huntsmen and foresters. And in the middle there, you can see some of the emblems of a blacksmith with tongs, a hammer, and a horseshoe. Not every cross slab has an emblem, so we can't say for certain who was the patron of every single monument, but the overall corpus of slabs with emblems allows us to say in general terms the sorts of people that could utilize cross slab commemoration, as well as it allows us to highlight the aspects of their personal and group identities that they thought it was most important to display, and what they wanted remembered about themselves after they died. As cross slabs developed stylistically over time, they also occasionally incorporated inscriptions or semi-effigies and heraldry in addition to the main cross motif. But these additions are exceptions rather than the rule, and they seem to come over to cross slabs from those other contemporary forms of commemoration, rather than being part of the monument form from the start. So on the left here, you can see two examples of semi-effigial work, one a little more like we would imagine an effigy, although with this kind of cross and base here laying over her lower half. Here we have very much what would be a cross slab with these foliate sprigs coming out on either side, except it's got a guy's head in the middle of the cross slab rather than a cross design. Over here you have, as you can see, maybe some chickens on the shield, which is somebody's heraldry. And here you can see an example of an inscription. So hic jacet Gerardus de somebody deus anima deus miseratur. So later on, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the frequency of the use of emblems versus inscriptions, as I think it's really important for our understanding of how cross slabs engaged with their audiences. Did they do that primarily through visual means, or did they do it primarily through textual ones? And it's an important distinction because on some other monuments like brasses, the text becomes extremely important, and we don't seem to see that in the same way with cross slabs. And it's also key to understand how people expressed individual identities and who the audiences were that the monuments were directed towards, because obviously if you're using text, you're assuming on some level that people can read it. If you're not using text, are you actively choosing to engage with a wider audience that may not necessarily be able to read? And what it also shows, I think, that's really interesting is that cross slabs seem to go about the business of commemorating in a different way to at least brasses and to some extent effigies, because on those, the image of the person and their name written in words on cross slabs doesn't seem to be as significant as on other monumental forms. And why that might be is really interesting question. Does it mean that if you had a cross slab in a relatively small settlement, that pretty much everybody knew who you were? You didn't need to put your name or an image on there because it was so limited who could get these sorts of stone monuments in a rural village. Does it mean that you were assuming that most of your audience couldn't read? We tend to think of prayer clauses like orate pro anima, the pray for the soul of, being supremely important once the doctrine of purgatory is firmly entrenched in the 13th century. And we think that because it's so common on brasses, but most slabs don't have that. We do see it on some, like this one that I've got, which says, may God have mercy on his soul. But in all those that don't, does that mean that these monuments were mostly securing those prayers in other ways? Or could more inscriptions have been painted on than carved, and we've now lost them? So I think those are all questions to think about. So now I'll detail a little bit about how we've approached this project methodologically and why. Most studies of medieval commemoration have been dominated by brasses and effigies because they are artistically and aesthetically the best products of the funerary monument industry. But because these studies have often focused on artistic merit and the most exotic or interesting pieces, or pieces they can match to a known individual, they don't tend to take account of the regional patterning that is clearly present in commemoration. And as we're going to see in a minute, the northern counties display cohesive trends at a really big regional level, as well as remarkable variety at smaller scales. And what we see in the north in terms of commemorative production and use does seem to be different than other regions of the country, with the caveat that not other regions of the country haven't been as well recorded as the north. So we may have some surprises if we start really systematically looking through other regions of the country. At the biggest scale, there's a region-wide preference for stone monumental commemoration that's established well before the conquest in the Anglo-Saxon and the Viking eras. And there's far more pre-conquest sculpture in the north than anywhere else. From that point forward, the north also acquires both the distinct and long-lasting affinity for cross slabs. And it's distinct from Midland, Southern, and Eastern England in that it doesn't have the large amounts of brasses, particularly, that are often seen in those areas. And in addition, areas outside Northern England generally tended to either significantly lessen or abandon their use of cross slabs after the 13th century, whereas in the north, that tradition keeps going. So we do see a definite regional pattern. And this project was devised specifically to allow us to assess big regional patterns and smaller intra-regional and local patterns. Because that field recording involves systematically visiting every medieval parochial church or chapel site that was still identifiable to search for slabs or fragments of slabs, Whether or not the building on the site is still medieval, we do think we have pretty good coverage of, although occasionally someone will find something in their backyard and things like that. So we are always open to adding to the database if we've missed something. And that comprehensive recording is really important because we know that post-medieval churchyard clearances and the persistent renovation of churches in the 18th to 20th centuries has undoubtedly resulted in a substantial loss of cross slabs. And that being said, heavy 19th century alteration to the medieval fabric is not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to finding these monuments. Often we find them a lot more when Victorians have gone through and restored a church, found the cross slabs that have been shoved into foundations or windowsills or into stairwells, and brought them out and stuck them, into a rockery or onto a porch or something like that. And that sort of deliberate display and preservation of the monuments by 19th century antiquarian vicars and things like that has in most cases been really great for us, except when they stick them somewhere that's very exposed to the elements, and then you can't get it out of that wall, and then it ends up being weathered over time. Alongside parish churches, which make up the majority of the sites we've looked at, we've also systematically visited cathedrals and monastic sites and castles and other major fortifications. Because although cross slabs are primarily associated with parochial commemoration, they do occur relatively often in religious houses and even in castle chapels and things like that. Museums and heritage sites and stores are often repositories for cross slabs that get found in excavations or when redundant churches have been lost. So we also searched through them as well. And there are a remarkable number of cross slabs in museum stores that aren't out on display, which we were really surprised by. So the Yorkshire Museum had loads, which it had collected over the years from various excavations around York, but had never gone on display. So all slabs found on a site, regardless of how fragmentary, get measured, described in writing, and photographed wherever we could. And a measured sketch was produced and later drawn up to scale. And I will emphasize that all drawings you see are by Peter Ryder, not by me, because I can't draw, but he's very good at it. I need to stop my children screaming. Hang on just a minute. Guys, you have to stop screaming, okay, now. No, Bill, now. Right, sorry about that. So black and white drawings are by far the best way of representing these monuments in catalogs, as due to the often extreme weathering and awkward positioning and poor lighting, it's often difficult to see the complete iconographic scheme just in photographs. And then after recording, the identified sites and slabs are entered into a digital database into which the previously recorded and published monuments had already been entered. And thus we have our full database. So now some of the findings of the project so far, an overview of Northern County cross slab statistics as a whole is 4,091 slabs at 739 sites with an average density of 5.5 slabs per site across the whole of the north, and about 50% of the slabs have emblems. So there are big numbers here, but also prevalence. The majority of surviving medieval church sites in the region have these monuments. We already knew from studies published before this project that there was a distinct affinity for cross slabs in the north as opposed to other parts of the country. And you can see from the numbers across different counties here, there's kind of a line in the East Midlands, below Nottinghamshire, you get fewer slabs, although there is some, and I think David Stocker's here, I think Lincolnshire and Leicestershire and those areas may well have more slabs than we're currently aware of from Lawrence Butler's 1960 surveys. So that line may be a little bit lower down the country than we so far know. The particular numbers in this table aren't important, and they're going to differ in this chart from the numbers you'll see on my maps, because it's based on previously published work only. But the overall pattern of cross slabs preference, it kind of is what we want to show here. We see a steady decrease in the density of slabs per site as we move from the far north of England, in Northumberland and Durham, down through the rest of the north and into the Midlands. The chart also shows remarkable levels of distribution and prevalence. In areas like County Durham and Northumberland, cross slabs would probably once have been present at every single church in the county. In southern areas of the country, that's not as certain, with that same caveat that southern surveys have not been quite so systematic as those up north. It's easy to chalk up that striking provision of cross slabs in the northern counties to a regional fashion. But I think it's important to emphasize that fashion wasn't accidental. When we classify objects from the past, we often think about technologies or forms or styles moving and trickling down and expanding as if they're kind of doing it on their own. But it's much more accurate to think of what we call styles or regional fashions being the result of people's deliberate choices made repeatedly over long periods of time. And these choices were bound up with complex and perhaps quite regionally and locally specific religious and economic and cultural and political issues that drove the commemorative strategies that patrons chose and the ones that they valued, the monuments that they valued and were meaningful to them. When we directly compare the prevalence of cross slabs with brasses and effigies, it's clear that northern patrons seem to have often consciously chosen cross slabs over other available forms of commemoration, despite the fact that brasses and effigies would have had a lot of connotations of prestige because they were more expensive, they required more technical skill to make them, and they were harder to acquire. Cumberland and Northumberland, and especially Westmoreland, are remarkably poor in medieval brasses from so far as we know. Yorkshire and Durham do have more, but most of the brasses from those counties are found in the cathedrals and the urban centers, rather than across the whole range of rural parish churches. Even taking that into account, the number of brasses in comparison to cross slabs is pretty striking. Yorkshire as a whole features only 17 surviving brasses dating to before 1350, with the awareness that obviously it's easier to destroy a brass because you can melt it down, but we do have surviving indents and things like that. Brass provision does pick up in the later Middle Ages in all three ridings of Yorkshire, but there are less than 100 surviving brasses from the 14th and 15th centuries, and most date to the late 15th century. Across the whole of rural Yorkshire, Sally Badham calculates there are about 300 surviving medieval brasses, with another likely 260 lost but recorded in antiquarian sources. But this should be compared with about 2,000 surviving cross slab monuments in Yorkshire, and that's not even mentioning how many we've lost. The other northern counties have similar discrepancies, and in most cases, they're even more marked. Due to a lack of comprehensive recording, we know less about numbers of effigies than we do about brasses and cross slabs. But the majority of effigies in the northern counties seem to be quarried and carved locally rather than being major imported monuments. And we do know from Brian and Moira Gittos's Yorkshire effigies project that there are just over 200 surviving monuments in the whole county, dating up to around 1400. There will definitely be more from the 15th and 16th centuries, but it gives us a ballpark number. Effigial distribution is not as urban focused as brasses, so they may have served as a stronger competitor for cross slabs when rural patrons were making choices about what sort of monument to get. But all of our evidence does point to the dominance of cross slabs throughout the rural north. And they would have absolutely have been as significant to the social and spiritual life of medieval England as figural brasses and tombs and effigies were, and maybe they had an even greater impact in northern England. They were in use over a longer period of time. They were located at considerably more sites, and they would have been patronized and engaged with and understood by a far wider range of social groups than some of those other more elite forms of commemoration. So that long tradition of use and their prevalence would have accentuated their value in the eyes of northern patrons who wished to commemorate in a form and a style that was widely understood and esteemed and valued throughout the region. So given the stark variations in commemoration across the country, cross slabs may have been seen as identifiably northern in character, particularly by the later Middle Ages, and that regional social identity may have been a reason why patrons continued to choose them, even when they had other options. So now that we've seen the commemorative character of the region as a whole, we can start to break that down, and we can see both consistency and variation across the whole of the North. You can see here the number of slabs at how many sites in each of the different counties, and the percentages of churches, parish churches that have them. So in Northumberland and Durham, 92% of parish sites have them, 85% in Durham, getting down into the 50%, around 50% in some of the lower areas, or just above in the West Riding. But what we can see is that there are a lot of cross slabs, they're well distributed. There are fewer slabs in raw numbers in the East Riding of Yorkshire and Westmoreland than in the rest of the North, but not necessarily at many fewer sites. Just under half of parish churches have them in each county. So they're not tightly distributed. They are widely spread. They're not all concentrated in a few parishes. So the difference is more in density, in how many slabs per church. And we can see that here. Again, very high densities in the two northernmost counties. Cumberland and Westmoreland, well, Cumberland, North Yorkshire, West Riding, and the District of York all hover around 5, which is about the regional average. And then Westmoreland and East Yorkshire, again, are lower. Whether the patterns of low density are driven by the same underlying forces in Westmoreland and East Yorkshire, I think is less certain though, and I'm going to explore that now. So looking just at Yorkshire, we can see that the East Riding is definitely operating on a different trend than the rest of the county. And that may have had something to do with the geology of the area. Compared to the North and West Ridings, which have lots of sandstone and limestone, there's much less easily carvable freestone in the East Riding. The bright yellow that you can see on this geology map is all chalk. The thin strips of cream colors here are good limestones. And I think the browns and pinks are sandstone as you go further west. As most cross slabs are carved from locally sourced stone, the lack of available material may have had an impact on the local monument industry and limited cross slabs access to those who had the money to get one from further away. But the patterns of prevalence aren't simply about geology or geography. In other parts of the country, the presence of freestone didn't mean that cross slabs would automatically be made there. But given that cross slab production is generally localized, and we only rarely see imports from major workshops like Purbeck Marble, the availability of local stone and carvers to work it may have affected not only the choices that were available to patrons and how cost effective those choices were, but also the value and significance that cross slabs took on in the region. If there were fewer cross slabs in churches, as in the East Riding or further south, then less regional identity might have been bound up with them, with their use and display. And if getting a monument at all meant importing it, the choice between a brass and a cross slab may have seemed less stark, compared to places where brasses were imported, but cross slabs were easily locally acquired. Sally Badham's distribution map of Yorkshire brasses shows that their distributions are focused in the central Vale of York here and the east coast of the East Riding, where river and sea traffic would have made their transport from York and from southern England easier. So further work on cross slab patterning within the East Riding may start to reveal important correlations between brass provision and cross slab provision. And that shows the importance of not just looking at the slabs themselves, but at the wider monumental context for understanding the patterns that we're seeing. If we dig down even further, we can see that the West Riding shows some interesting internal patterning. And this is something that's just come up because of the new field work we did. Overall, the riding's density of slabs per site is comparable with the region as a whole, but it has by far the largest overall number of slabs in the 3 ridings, and indeed all of the northern counties, and that's because it's so big. There's tons and tons of churches in the West Riding. But we can break down the areas within the West Riding to look more closely at a couple sub-regions, so sort of modern West Yorkshire and modern South Yorkshire. And in this, we can see remarkable differentiation even within this relatively small area. This map of cross slabs over here with just sort of crude marks on it, the red are sites with slabs and the blue are sites without. And you can see that if you look at the West Riding as a whole, it's pretty evenly distributed. There are a few gaps, notable gaps in a few places, but basically overall, there's no obvious difference between modern West Yorkshire and modern South Yorkshire. But when you start to look at density, you see a big difference. So West Yorkshire has an average density of about 3.5 slabs per site, and South Yorkshire has an average density of 6.5 slabs per site. And one possible influence on this could be the centralized alabaster incised slab and effigy industry, which we know was very prominent in parts of Derbyshire and spread into South Yorkshire in the 15th and 16th centuries. We already know that large late medieval incised floor slabs of the types produced in these workshops are more common in the West Riding than in other parts of Yorkshire. I haven't been able to do a more detailed breakdown of styles by sub-region yet, but I suspect that we'll see more of these late medieval floor slabs showing up in the Southern West Riding than anywhere else. And what this may mean is that access that South Yorkshire patrons had to these prestige industries and the pressure to keep up with the latest fashions across the border in Derbyshire may have influenced what was going on in the cross slab provision in the area. As with East Yorkshire and brasses, we see here the importance of looking beyond the cross slab industry to other monument types in order to understand the distributions that we're seeing. Unlike other areas of the country where the rise of a new monument type spelled the end of cross slab use, the incised slab industry in Derbyshire and the West Riding may have increased cross slab patronage throughout the late Middle Ages as the workshops were churning out both monument styles side by side. So these workshops were producing alabaster incised effigies and incised slabs, and also churning out these big cross slab floor slabs in sandstone and things like that too. Now that you've got a sense of the regional patterning, I'm going to drill down a bit more into features of the slabs themselves and what insight they can give us. So secondary emblems are really common characteristic of northern cross slab monuments, but not those found in other parts of the country. We know that about 1/3 to 3/4 of northern cross slabs have them, depending on which county you're in, but they're pretty much absent south of the East Midlands. There are some indications that they may be more common in Western England and Wales, but those surveys are sporadic at the moment, so we need to do more work on that. Military emblems, primarily swords, are the dominant emblem in all regions. So the primary patrons of these monuments were likely men who were members of at least the minor or knightly elite, or who aspired to that level of status and esteem. Female and priestly emblems come next, followed by those of various professions and different occupations. There are a few interesting patterns worth picking out here. Although emblems in the East Riding are more rare overall, the fact that most are military and clerical aligns well with the likelihood that getting a slab was more expensive in the East Riding than in other areas of the North, because you would have had to pay more to import it. York and its surrounding districts have a far higher proportion, although it's not many emblems, the proportion at 27% is occupational emblems than other counties. And it's equal to the number of military emblems there, which is considerably lower than in other counties. And that may speak to the peculiarity of commemoration in an urban environment, where a variety of tradesmen were generating expendable wealth, as well as where a wider array of monuments was more immediately available, perhaps drawing some of the secular elite patronage where we might expect our military emblems to show up, away from slabs and towards brasses. We start seeing occupational emblems on slabs from the 13th century onwards. There's a few slabs that might be 12th century, but most of the time when we see occupational emblems, they're showing up from the 13th century. They're mainly blacksmiths, huntsmen and foresters, and carpenters and masons. What's interesting is some of the occupations we know were important that we don't seem to see any emblems of. So things like millers don't seem to show up, or if they do, we don't really recognize what that is, what emblem that is. And what's interesting about the crafts that do show up is I think they're ones that held particular value in the milieu of the manor. So their services and products would have been essential to lords and the material trappings and behaviors that they needed to maintain their social status. So the armor, weapons, and horse fittings that the blacksmiths would have produced, the hunting that the foresters and huntsmen enabled to happen, and the buildings that carpenters and masons were building. In some regions, such as County Durham and in the Northwest, it appears that practitioners of an ostensibly lowly agricultural occupation could get a cross slab. So we have here what's thought to be a plowshare or a coulter from a plow. So that seems to indicate, alongside a sword, seems to indicate a man, but who also is kind of emphasizing some agricultural laboring. And there's other examples apart from that one in Cumberland. So this may be indicative of the significant role that a wealthy tenant farmer could play in his village. But alongside the greater density of slabs that we see in the far north, it may indicate that in certain regions there was less control by local elites over who had access to a cross slab. It might widen the potential group of patrons who could obtain a monument if they were relatively easy to acquire. And it thus could alter the perception of the status of that monument to the local community. A nice counterpoint to these rural occupations are the insights that slabs from towns can give us into occupations that may have been peculiarly urban. So we have in examples from York, perhaps a bell founder here with a cauldron and a bell. A slab here with a cauldron and a fish. So perhaps a cook, a private cook or a town cook. And here a big cleaver, maybe indicating a butcher or a skinner. And then on the far right, we have a slab from Doncaster, which seems to show a ship. And there are other ones from Hartlepool and Newcastle, which may also indicate shipwrights. Detailed spatial analysis in the future might allow us to explore whether these can tell us something about urban social geography. So is there clusterings of certain trades in certain towns or in certain areas within the towns? And also which trades were coming up enough in the world to afford stone commemoration. It also shows the validity in comparing not only urban and rural provision, but the patrons and the types of monuments that they chose. Particularly as in urban locations, they would have been choosing from a much more wide-ranging commemorative market and would have competing with the middle class strata of society, so burgesses, guildsmen, merchants, that was peculiar to urban living. If we compare the frequency of emblems and inscriptions side by side, you can clearly see a dominance of emblems over inscriptions. So, imagery is the favored way of expressing identity as opposed to text. This, along with the lack of brasses in which inscriptions were a key feature, indicates that visual culture was dominant in Northern English commemoration. This may well be due to the rural focus of commemorative practice in the large northern counties. Many communities would have been far removed from urban societies where mass production and mercantile and middle class patronage and literate expressions of memory and devotion were common. In the milieu of the parish church and the manor, patrons needed to be able to communicate with a local audience that may have had limited literacy and for whom written conceptions of memorialization may have been less familiar or had less value. And in these situations, the prestige or elite status of an imported brass may have been less used to a patron than the local fluency of a cross slab's images. And so I think that's something that we need to take into account. The finer or more elite monument may not always have been the most valuable one in terms of what you were trying to do as a patron and who you needed to talk to. Emblems are clearly the dominant form of personal identifier across the board, but there are some instances of higher usage of inscriptions in Cumberland, in the West Riding, and in East Yorkshire. And all of these higher uses of inscriptions seem to correlate directly with the date distributions of slabs in each county. All the regions with more inscriptions also have a higher number of 15th and 16th century cross slabs. And very late slabs are those most likely to bear inscriptions, as we saw in some of those examples from South Yorkshire earlier, those big floor slabs. And I think it also demonstrates the growing importance and pervasiveness of the word in commemorative practice as we approach the end of the Middle Ages. The reasons behind the prevalence of very late medieval slabs would have been locally determined. However, the West Riding enjoys an economic upturn in the 15th century due to the textile trade, but this was not the case in other parts of the North. And the vast majority of inscriptions on late West Riding slabs come from elaborate high status floor slabs like this one from Tickhill, which may have been produced in those big centralized workshops. In contrast, Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Northumberland, having a lot of late medieval slabs, doesn't necessarily indicate marked late medieval economic prosperity or centralized workshops. Inscriptions were being used more often than they had been previously. But in these remote and cut off areas, production remained localized. And we can see this in the quality of the carving and the inscription, and also in the survival of cross slabs after the Reformation. The more late medieval cross slabs you have does seem to correlate directly with the lower number of brasses in the whole of the North. I think particularly true in the West Riding, the Cumberland, so the far Northwest. So the brass industry was particularly foreign and drew off almost no late medieval cross slab patronage. But in Durham and Yorkshire, there was more access, and it had made more inroads into the social groups who had been patronizing cross slabs before. What I'm going to close with is a couple slabs as examples which I think tell nice stories to remind us there are people behind all those maps and percentages. And these monuments give us some specific insight into how individual people navigated their choices in material culture and the social drivers that they might have been encountering. And they give us little vignettes looking into medieval lives. So these two slabs from Wycliffe and Dereham are nice examples of what I might call shears in confusing situations. So the first from Wycliffe, you can see that there's a pair of shears here, but it's in this strange hollowed out bit. And there's these two parallel lines going down. And what seems to have happened at some point, what you can also see is a very large, high relief, late medieval crosshead about circa 1300. And an inscription down the side in Norman French, which says, "Here lies Isolde," or somebody like that, wife of Thomas of somebody. So what's going on here seems to be that there's an earlier cross slab, which is incised, not in relief, which once had a sword on it. And then they reused it for some reason and carved shears into it. And the shears and the inscription clearly go together because they're both indicating a woman. And it's possible that the head of the cross gets changed or revamped at that point too. The cross head and the language and script of the inscription seem to match date-wise. So this lady is kind of a big deal. She gets an inscription, a very fine crosshead carved by a sculptor who knows what he's doing. So is this a chance reuse, a spare lying around of a monument, an old monument? Does it make it cheaper? Is it more meaningful or purposeful in some way? Is it a member of the family? She's overwritten or overcut the sword of the previous owner. There's lots of questions, I think, they're raised by that. Dereham here, you've got shears, but also a book with a clasp, which would technically, usually we'd interpret that as a clerical item. So it would be unusual to find it paired on a monument with shears. When you do see paired items in a double slab, like commemorating two people, you usually see shears and a sword, so man and wife. But the book here would, in next to a chalice or something, you definitely indicate a priest. So what are the shears doing there? And one of the things that this might be showing is the growing use of psalters or prayer books by the secular elite in the later Middle Ages. We do know particularly of their importance as objects of status, and they were enormously important to elite medieval women because of their paired identities of literacy and piety. So the book here could be a book of hours or a similar sort of indicator of a demonstration of femininity and status and piety all in one. So a book may not just be a priest, but may be an elite woman. This slab is John Barton from South Cave. This is a very little slab, about half size, though very wide, from South Cave in the East Riding. It's one of the few examples of a trade emblem that we have from the East Riding. We've got a mason set square here. And we know that there's a man named John Barton, who's a Mason, who requests to be buried in the church in his will of 1483. And this is probably not an imported piece of limestone, but rather sourced from the thin band of Lincolnshire limestone on which South Cave and its quarries sat. So it's fairly mediocre and idiosyncratic in the way it's produced. It suggests production by a local mason rather than a major specialist workshop, but it's carved by somebody who's aware of the motifs of much finer workshop produced monuments that are circulating in the East Riding at the time. So you can see this one from Beverley is very nicely done with this nice pedestal base, and you can see this slab kind of trying to imitate that. So Barton may well have been one of the most prestigious craftsmen in his village. And he displayed some social ambition, indicating his professional status with a set square, but also laying a very likely completely false claim to the heraldic devices of a knightly family, and attempting to emulate in local materials and local skills the top of the line monuments of the region. And lastly, we have this slab from Stanwick St. John, right at the top of North Yorkshire, which is here to remind us that sometimes the stories and the people behind these slabs are fascinating, but also completely impenetrable and obscure. Most of the slab has been lost to destruction, and the meanings have been lost as well. There's a whole church full of 39 other very normal cross slabs, and then we have this, on which I have no idea what's going on. There's a woman's head, possibly wearing a headdress or maybe a nun's wimple. There's a pair of shears, which would seem to indicate the female patron. There's this strange kind of foliate sprig, which might be a foliate sprig. It might be, some people have suggested, a flabellum, which is a kind of liturgical fan. And then there's this fish, crocodile, something like that, like a pike. You know, any answers that people have or suggestions on a postcard, if you have any clues. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed this tour through the cross slabs in Northern England, and that you've been convinced that even the humbler brothers of finer brasses and effigies have some really great insights to offer us about medieval belief and economy and society, and of course the actual people of the Middle Ages. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you, Alex. That was absolutely fascinating. That was fantastic introduction to the topic for anyone who doesn't know anything about it, really. But also, I think you really raised some interesting questions, and I have a host, but it's not my prerogative to ask them, because I also know that we have a whole bunch of questions that have gone into the chat box. So I'll hand over to Rob to field them.
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks, Alex. There was an overwhelming amount of questions coming in from the very beginning towards the end about whether we can identify the work of individual masons in local or wider areas, and if there's any marks that are able to tell us anything about that.
Right, they don't seem to use mason's marks in the same way that, you know, that we see on buildings, where you can start to identify, you know, particular individuals, because they're being paid by the reason that they're using mason's marks in buildings, so far as I understand it, but somebody else can correct me if I'm wrong, is that you had to put your mark on to show how many blocks you quarried or you carved, so you could get paid by the stone. These, we don't seem to see any sort of signatures of masons or anything like that. We definitely do see groupings of cross slabs at a single church or churches in a small area that are often very similar to each other, which would suggest a single guy or a small workshop that's churning out the same sort of slab. Kind of more than, you know, more often to a template, that kind of thing. We do often, not often, but sometimes see indications of secondary carving, which may indicate two different kinds of masons. You know, maybe something's come from a workshop and then they've added something to it. I think Lawrence Butler mentioned one of those in his surveys of the East Midlands, where there was obviously a workshop produced monument that had gotten shipped, and then somebody kind of scratched an emblem onto it. But yeah, we don't know much about the kinds of guys who are actually producing these. My speculation is that there are probably some people who are part-time stone carvers who are doing this. Because if you think in a small village or relatively small local rural area, not that many people who need a stone monument are dying. that often. So you may have a guy who mostly does carpentry or something like that, and then in a pinch will do you a slab if you can get the stone for him. You know, if you can source the stone, or you get some, or he can get it for you, and then he'll do one. And we certainly see a lot of very idiosyncratic carvings that are aware of what's going on elsewhere, but they're probably done by somebody who doesn't do this all the time.
Mm. There's quite an interesting comment here, which I think is an interesting way to look at these as well. Is, do you think the slabs are ever skeuomorphs of a pall over a coffin with objects laid on top of a lid?
We do see that. So there's a pre-conquest slab at Kirkdale, which they almost certainly think are skeuomorphs, because it's got like little tassels kind of all around the edge of the slab, and I think that's an 8th or 9th century slab. So that idea is not foreign to people. However, I don't know if it's objects laid on top. I think in some cases, like chalices and patens, we do know that they're sometimes included inside the grave of priests. There are other instances. I think there's pre-conquest examples of women being buried with shears and keys and things like that, so emblems of the household. So there may have been a kind of idea of these are the things that you might include, but for the most part, grave goods are not really a common part of being buried in the later Middle Ages. So maybe they move from an idea of what goes in the grave to an idea of the kinds of things that represent you, and you represent them on the monument. But yeah, there, I know that it's kind of a question that's up in the air, because I think, you know, in the pre-conquest period, they definitely are doing that.
Thank you. There are so many questions coming in now. Quite a lot of them, actually, I have to say, are about what you've just sort of alluded to there, pre-conquest memorials, and the conversations that some of the imagery on these later slabs have with pre-conquest stones. Is there anything you can say about that? Just a general question about how they may have related.
I don't have the right pictures. I have loads, but I haven't used any of them today, because I didn't specifically focus on that kind of transitional and Norman conquest period. But there's some great examples of real hangovers from things like hogbacks, you know, hogback stones, that kind of shape. We see some coped stones, even with like tegulation, like the roof tiles that we see on represented on hogbacks. Some coped stones that are definitely not hogbacks, but have that kind of shape and that tegulation, probably from the 11th century. I know there's an example at Yarm in the North Riding. There may be more. There's a good example from, oh, I can't remember where, it's somewhere on the east coast of Yorkshire, that you've got a it looks like it's like half of a standing head of a cross, like a standing cross with the little kind of halo, you know, the kind of a circle joining the arms, which looks like a pre-conquest form. But then on the end of one of the arms, there's Norman zigzag. So there's some examples like that. There's others where in pre-conquest monuments, you often have a kind of central divider, and then you have interlace on either side. And then you have early Norman examples where you've got the central cross kind of forming that divider shape. And then you've got geometric designs and hatching and zigzag and things like that. So using those Norman architectural motifs where you would have used interlace in the 10th century. So there are some definite ties. So they're definitely aware. They've come into, in Northern England, an area where there's enormous amounts of pre-conquest sculpture. And maybe even in the 11th century, some of the same people who were producing you know, late Viking age sculpture continue to produce cross slabs, because it's a localized monument industry.
Oh, I forgot time for one more question. There was an interesting one here about how we conserve these slabs and look after them today. And if there's any work being done in museums or anything to digitally reconstruct, maybe some of the ones that you mentioned might have color to get an original.
Yeah, so color is a tough one. I had, when I did my PhD, John Blair gave me a massive grilling about why I hadn't talked more about painting. And I was like, because I don't have any evidence of it. But I imagine they would have been painted. You know, we know the churches themselves would have been painted a lot more. Undoubtedly, the heraldry and stuff like that would have had coloring on them to help distinguish. but yeah, we don't have surviving pigment, so it's really hard to say what would have gone, you know, what would have been painted on them, or what exactly they would have looked like. But in terms of conservation, if you are in a local church and you know you have some of these, just get them inside. That's the most important thing. Put them inside where they're dry. They're not going to get rained on. They're not going to spall off from weathering. And don't put them near a heater or something like that where they might crack or whatever. But yeah, the main thing, I mean, they're pretty robust for the most part. I mean, they survive outside for exceptionally long periods of time. And our stone, at least in the north, is nice and hard. It's not like that, you know, red sandstone or whatever that's weathering away really easily. So for the most part, they will survive, but if you can move them, getting them inside is the best thing in terms of conserving. In terms of reconstruction, we did do a little experimentation to see if, what's it called? There's the photographic technique where, I can't remember what it's called right now, where you take a whole bunch of photographs with different light angles. So you kind of do a dome with a full light angle. If anybody knows what that's called, put it in the chat so I don't look stupid. And then what it enables you to do is see really fine, worn away incisions. And you can often, because you can change, once you've digitized it, then you can change the angle of the light and bring the bring that those things out. Yeah, so I've got some suggestions here. Photogrammetry. There is yeah, and other names for it, but yeah, that has RTI is what that's called, and that has some possibilities for maybe bringing out some of these which are really hard to see now, but you could have, you know, a digital display where somebody could explore the inscription or the carving and see it better, you know, from different light angles and things like that. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, we're mostly working with churches to help them realize what they've got, write little you know, interpretation things for them so that they can promote it to visitors and stuff like that. I did have a note from Chris Brook, which I had forgotten. He and Peter have done Nottinghamshire as well. So about 440 slabs from Nottinghamshire. So we are working, they are working their way down into the Midlands proper. Lancashire, somebody's just asked, is there any data from Lancashire? Peter has a little bit of isolated stuff from when he's just been, you know, occasionally, but Lancashire was a stretch too far to be able to do. It would need a lot of on the ground. But I think it would be really interesting, given that what we know from the Northwest, to try to see, and also the bordering onto Cheshire and Wales as well.
I think that's probably good.
Well, no, fantastic. I like the way you're working down, but perhaps by the time you retire, Alex, you might make Cornwall.
I'm going to need help. I need people from other parts of the country to start recording stuff.
And actually recording is so critical.
The minute you record it, we will happily access it into our database.
I mean, I was very interested by the last question about preservation, because I was very struck on a visit fairly recently to Doncaster Minster that slabs that were incorporated in the crypt that Peter recorded 20 years ago, some of them are now illegible.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Environmental conditions in
yeah, I mean, there are some
crypt.
drawings we have from Peter's in the 80s that it's lucky we have them, because the slabs have been lost or they are absolutely gone. You can't see it at all anymore. And even things that I recorded in my PhD in the mid 2000s are gone. They've gone walkabout, you know, they've disappeared. So if they're easy to move, they get lost. So, you know, they're if they're not huge, they can move. So yeah, definitely any recordings, any photographs that you can that people can take is useful.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I hope that wasn't a negative note to end on. But anyway, I'll draw it to a close. Just for me to say thank you very much to our speaker, Alex. Also to just let you know that next month's talk will be by Tracy Collins, and she's going to be talking about female monasticism in Ireland, but particularly focusing on recent excavations at St Catherine's in County Limerick. So I think, you know, it'd be a rather nice contrast to go across the water to the Emerald Isle for our next talk. So I hope you can all join us then. Thank you all to speaker Alex, to Rob for doing all the behind behind the scenes technical stuff, and to you all for attending. And we will hopefully see you soon. Thank you.